Hello, today I'm taking a look at a Methode Cap Classique wine, so a traditional method or bottle fermented sparkling wine from the Western Cape in South Africa. So this is Pongracz, and this is a non-vintage rosé version of that. The wine is, I believe, a blend of 60% Pinot Noir and 30% Chardonnay, and it's named after a Hungarian emigre, Desiderius Pongrácz. Evidently, Pongracz grew up in Hungary prior to the Second World War and ended up serving in that country's armed forces in the fight against the Russians. He was eventually captured, made a prisoner of war, but when he was finally released from that status, he returned to Hungary only to find that it was a country that he no longer wanted to live in. So in 1958, when there was an awful lot of upheaval in Hungary, he decided to take the opportunity to leave the country and went to South Africa, where he found employment working in viticulture. 15 years later, by 1973, he was the Chief of Viticulture for the Distillers Corporation. And they were quite a large company. They later merged with Stellenbosch wine farmers to form a company called Distell. And actually, in the last few years, Distell has actually been subsumed into Heineken. But the group's been associated with brands such as Edinburgh, Drostihof, Methode Cap, some quite well-known mainstream South African brands. However, I think their largest brand was actually Amarula, a fruit-flavoured cream liqueur. But as a result, yes, they were a major exporter of South African wines and spirits. So the importance of Distillers Corporation was such that Pongracz was able to encourage the selection of quality, modern grape varieties and the best clones he could find of those varieties. So yes, he was responsible for bringing into the country quality cuttings of Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, and Pinot Noir, and other important producers followed his lead. For instance, Danny de Vet, well-known Chardonnay producer, was somebody who was influenced by Pongracz in terms of importing high-quality Chardonnay grape material into the country. As well as his influence on planting material, Pongracz was also responsible for writing one of the standard viticulture textbooks for the Cape, a book entitled Practical Viticulture, which from the 70s onwards was something of a handbook for producers in this region. Unfortunately, Pongracz died relatively young at the age of 61 in 1985 when he was involved in a nasty car accident, quite typically when he was delivering Chardonnay cuttings to the Eetcake winery. So in fact, Pongracz didn't actually have anything to do with this wine or the range of wines that are named after him. They're named in commemoration of his contribution to the quality of vine material available today in South Africa. In fact, the company's top sparkling wine cuvee is a beautifully presented wine called Desiderius Pongrácz, named in honour of the man. These wines are made at a winery called the Pongracz. That's in the Devon Valley, which is one of the cooler sub-regions of Stellenbosch. Fruit for these wines is largely sourced from growers, and it'll come from the cooler areas of Stellenbosch, from Elgin, from Darling, but also from the warmer Robertson area. The grapes that go into the Pongracz sparkling wines are entirely picked by hand, and they're picked into and transported in shallow cages so that the fruit isn't bruised or pressed or damaged in any way during picking or on its way to the winery. The grapes are harvested at between 18 and 20 bome, so not at particularly high ripeness, and the process of harvesting goes on from early January into mid-February. The fruit is whole bunch pressed and skin contact is kept to an absolute minimum to stop the juice from gaining colour or from taking tannins out of the grape skins. The clear juice is allowed to settle and is then pumped into stainless steel tanks to do its first fermentation there. Once second fermentation has taken place in the bottle, the yeast is kept in there for a further 2 years, allowing the breakdown of that yeast to give yeasty flavours to the wine and also to help it fix a bead of smaller bubbles. And then the sediment is removed at dégorgement, at a stage where the wine will be topped up slightly and will gain its dosage to give it at a consistent but relatively low level of sweetness that will help to balance the wine's high acidity. As I've said, the blend for this wine is approximately 60% Pinot Noir and 40% Chardonnay. However, it's only at this stage of dosage that colour is introduced to the wine. So in fact, the blend of this is approximately the same as for the white non-vintage cuvee of the same wine. The difference being that the sugar for the dosage is mixed into a red still Pinot Noir wine and added to each bottle at that stage, giving the wine its rosé colour. The bottles are then corked and they're left to rest for at least 2 to 4 months prior to being shipped. I don't actually know what dosage was added, but I know the final sugar level in this is 10.5 grams per litre of sugar. So it's probably somewhere between 8 to 10 grams of sugar being added. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? First thing to say is that there really is quite a sort of salmon pink colour. It really looks gorgeous against the evening sunshine there. So I'm swirling it. I can still see a few tiny bubbles. I've been talking for a while, and they do seem to have faded somewhat. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? The aromas are primarily of sort of quite autolytic, yeasty notes. There's almost a sort of savoury note, and sitting behind that there are red fruit notes, hints of strawberry, maybe sort of more red apple note, quite delicate, but sitting there nonetheless behind that sort of more savoury, yeasty influence. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate there is a lovely soft mousse. There are fine bubbles still sitting across the palate there. On balance the wine is dry because there's a lovely crisp, almost maybe slightly malic, sort of sharpish green acidity there that's giving the palate plenty of life. Sitting over the top of that, again, there are those sort of yeasty, maybe slightly toasty, biscuity, autolytic notes. And delicately behind that, again, with the pleasant red apple fruits quite to the fore. Good acidity is giving a lovely freshness that's keeping the palate lovely and clean. I'd say the fruit is quite straightforward, and there isn't a massive amount of development in the autolytic notes. This is not a hugely expensive wine, so I'm actually quite impressed at how fine the bead is, how fresh the acidity is, and the balance of the sweetness on the attack there. The wine has a reasonable length. Those red apple and yeasty notes continue on a clean finish, but they don't really develop any further. The alcohol is balanced. This is quite a simple wine, but it's really well made to its price point. I can't help thinking that just at the moment, maybe exchange rates with South Africa are somewhat to our advantage. Within its limits, the wine's a well-made quality sparkling wine. As far as the score's concerned, I did look. There isn't a Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this particular cuvee. And if I was having to score it, I think I'd probably score it at 89 out of 100. Because it is providing perfectly acceptable, very well-made drinking. It's not the world's most complex wine, but it is by no means simple or one-dimensional. And I will certainly enjoy having to finish the rest of the bottle. So thank you very much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you would like to watch more of these tastings, it would be great if you consider signing up and subscribing to my YouTube channel. That would really help us to grow. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. That would be a fantastic endorsement from you. I'd be very grateful for that. And if you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. I would love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I'll put a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this wine, and you can see if it's available in your market, and you can see at what price it's being sold. On those pages also, you'll find plenty more background information into the wines I look at. So again, thank you for joining me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me in the very near future for another tasting. But until then, bye for now.